The vibration of a smartphone on a marble countertop shouldn't sound like a death knell, but when the screen lit up at 6:14 a.m. on the morning of our 28th anniversary, I felt the air leave my lungs before I even read the name. We were supposed to be leaving for the airport in exactly 3 hours to catch a flight to Santorini, a trip I had meticulously planned for over a year to celebrate nearly 3 decades of marriage. I was standing in the kitchen of our glass-walled Bellevue penthouse, the grey Seattle mist clinging to the windows, steam rising from a cup of Earl Grey that I would never get to drink. I reached for the phone, expecting a last-minute confirmation from the private car service or perhaps a sentimental note from my husband Julian, who had spent the night at a hotel near his law firm to finish a closing. Instead, the words on the screen were a clinical execution of the life I knew. "Don't bother coming to the airport," the message read. "I'm taking Chloe to Greece instead. She's worked harder for this vacation than you have in 20 years, and frankly, she deserves to see the world while she's still young enough to enjoy it." The silence that followed was absolute, a heavy, suffocating pressure that seemed to vibrate in the cavernous space of our minimalist home. Chloe. She was 24, a legal glass ceiling breaker, in the making or so Julian had described her when he hired her as his executive assistant 18 months ago. I had invited her into this very kitchen for Christmas drinks, serving her vintage champagne and complimenting her on her ambition, never noticing the way her eyes lingered on the expensive art on our walls or the way Julian's voice softened when he spoke her name. I stood there for a long time, the cold marble floor chilling my bare feet, staring at the phone until the screen went black. Then I looked at the 2 designer suitcases standing sentry by the door, packed with the linen dresses and sun hats of a woman who no longer existed. "Deserves it more than you." Those 6 words were the catalyst for a fundamental chemical shift in my soul. For 28 years, I had been the silent engine behind Julian Vance's meteoric rise to the top of the Pacific Northwest's legal elite. I was the one who had deferred my own master's degree in landscape architecture to work 2 retail jobs while he finished law school. I was the one who had curated every guest list, managed every social crisis, and transformed myself into the perfect corporate spouse, a woman whose primary function was to reflect his success back at the world with a polished, effortless smile. I had become so adept at being the supporting character in Julian's narrative that I had forgotten I was the protagonist of my own. I walked through the penthouse, my footsteps echoing on the polished concrete floors. Every piece of furniture was an investment, every painting a statement of status. It was a museum dedicated to a man's ego, and I realized with a sudden jarring clarity that I was just another curated exhibit. I went into his private study, a room panelled in dark walnut that smelled of expensive scotch and old leather. His laptop sat on the desk, protected by a password I had known for a decade. With trembling fingers, I typed it in. It wasn't just Chloe. As I scrolled through archived folders and hidden email accounts, the reality of the last 5 years unfolded like a grisly forensic report. There had been a Sarah in Portland, a Maya in San Francisco, and a series of others whose names didn't matter because their purpose was always the same: to provide Julian with the novelty and adoration he felt I had grown too familiar to provide. The messages between him and Chloe were the most devastating. He had been complaining about my predictability for months, calling me a domestic anchor that was dragging him down. He told her that he felt more alive in 20 minutes with her than he had in 20 years with me. But then, tucked away in a digital folder labeled Personal Assets, I found something Julian had clearly forgotten. It was the deed to the penthouse and our summer home in the San Juan Islands. Years ago, during a high-stakes malpractice suit that threatened his firm's liquidity, Julian had transferred the titles of all our primary real estate into my name as a protective measure against potential creditors. It was a legal maneuver intended to shield his wealth, a testament to his absolute certainty that I would always be his loyal, submissive partner. He had never bothered to transfer them back lightly, because the idea of me ever leaving him or exercising my legal right to those properties was in his mind an impossibility. To Julian, I wasn't a person with agency. I was a permanent fixture of his landscape. A cold, diamond, hard resolve settled in my chest. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to call him and beg for an explanation that I already possessed. I was going to do what I had been doing for him for nearly 30 years. I was going to manage the situation. I picked up the phone and called Clara Sterling, a woman I had known since we were both ambitious 20-somethings, before I had traded my dreams for his. Clara was now the most ruthless and successful real estate broker in the city, a woman who specialized in off-market, high-speed transactions for the ultra-wealthy. "Clara, it's Elena," I said, my voice sounding strangely calm and resonant in the empty study. "I have a 3,000-square-foot penthouse in Bellevue and a 5-acre estate in the San Juans. I need them sold by tomorrow. Cash only, no contingencies, and the names of the buyers must remain confidential. I'm willing to take 20% below market value for a 48-hour closing." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Elena, are you okay? Is Julian?" "Julian is in Santorini with his 24-year-old assistant," I said, and for the first time I felt a ghost of a smile touch my lips. "And he left me the instructions to enjoy my time while he was away. I'm simply following his advice. Can you do it?" Claire's professional persona clicked into place. "For those properties at that price point, I have 3 investors who would have wire transfers initiated before the sun goes down. But Elena, you need to understand that once you sign those papers, you are effectively burning the bridge while you're still standing on it." I looked out the window at the sprawling Seattle skyline, at the grey water of the Puget Sound, and at the life I had built on a foundation of lies and self-abnegation. "The bridge is already ash, Clara," I told her. "I'm just clearing away the debris." The next 24 hours were a masterclass in calculated efficiency. While Julian was likely sipping a Certico on a balcony overlooking the Aegean Sea, I was meeting with Claire's legal team in a windowless office downtown. I signed my name dozens of times, each stroke of the pen feeling like a weight being lifted from my shoulders. By the time the sun set on the second day, I had liquidated over $12 million in real estate assets. The funds were wired into a private account I had established in my own name, a secret reserve I had maintained from a small inheritance my grandmother had left me years ago, which Julian had always dismissed as pin money. But I wasn't done. I went to our joint investment accounts. Julian had given me full administrative access years ago so that I could handle the tax filings and mundane paperwork he found beneath him. I moved exactly half of the liquid capital into my account. I was being fair, even if he hadn't been. Then I went to the safe deposit box at our bank. I took my jewelry, the pieces that had been passed down through my family, and the few items Julian had given me that actually had resale value. The rest, the extravagant diamonds he had bought me as apologies for late nights and forgotten birthdays, I left in the box with a copy of his text message taped to the velvet lining. As I walked back into the penthouse for the final time, the space felt different. It was no longer a home. It was just a collection of glass and steel. I went to the master bedroom and opened the closet. I didn't take much. I packed a single suitcase with clothes that didn't feel like a costume. I took my architectural drawing sets from 20 years ago, my favorite books, and the few photographs of my parents that hadn't been replaced by corporate portraits of me and Julian. I sat at my vanity and looked at the woman in the mirror. I was 52 years old. I had lines around my eyes that spoke of decades of stifled laughter and even more stifled tears. My hair was a perfect, expensive shade of blonde that required hours of maintenance to please Julian's aesthetic. I picked up a pair of shears from the bathroom drawer, and with a steady hand I cut it. I chopped the long, polished waves into a sharp, defiant bob. It was messy, it was uneven, and it was the most beautiful thing I had seen in years. I left one final thing on the kitchen island, a legal envelope containing the final sales agreements for the penthouse and the summer house, along with a note written on my personal stationery. "Julian, the house is gone," I wrote. "The life we lived was a structure with no integrity, and like any good architect, I've decided to demolish the site before starting over. Chloe deserves the view from Santorini. I hope she enjoys it, because when you return, you'll find that you no longer have a view in Seattle. Don't look for me. I finally moved into a space that belongs to me." I walked out of the building and hailed a taxi to SeaTac. I didn't go to Greece. I boarded a flight to Marseille, France. Decades ago, before Julian, I had spent a summer in the Luberon Valley, sketching the ancient stone farmhouses and the way the light hit the lavender field. I had always told Julian I wanted to go back to perhaps buy a small fixer-upper and finally practice the landscape design I had studied. He had always laughed, calling it a quaint hobby for a retiree. When I landed in France, the air felt different. It was thick with the scent of pine and rosemary, and the heat was a physical embrace. I checked into a small boutique hotel in Saint-Arme-de-Provence and spent the first week doing nothing but sleeping and eating fresh bread. The silence wasn't suffocating here. It was a canvas. Using a portion of the funds from the house sale, I purchased a dilapidated 18th century mass on the outskirts of a small village. It was a ruin of golden stone and crumbling tile, surrounded by 3 acres of neglected olive trees and wild thyme. To anyone else, it was a disaster. To me, it was a masterpiece waiting to happen. I hired local stonemasons and spent my days in work boots and linen shirts, my hands stained with soil and lime. I didn't hire an interior designer. I didn't consult a social calendar. I designed the gardens myself, creating a sanctuary of drought-resistant flora and hidden stone paths that led to nowhere but peace. The first time my phone rang with a number I recognized, I was standing on a ladder, pruning a gnarled olive branch. It had been 3 weeks since I left. I let it ring. Then it rang again. And again. Finally, I climbed down and answered. Elena Julian's voice was unrecognizable. It was high, thin, and vibrating with an emotion I couldn't quite identify. Perhaps it was rage, but there was an undercurrent of genuine terror. "What have you done?" "I'm standing in the lobby of the penthouse and the concierge won't let me up. He says the unit was sold. He says there are new owners moving in tomorrow." "Elena, answer me." I walked to the edge of my terrace and looked out at the valley where the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gold. "I sold the house, Julian," I said, my voice steady, "and the house in the San Juans. They were in my name, and I exercised my right to liquidate my assets." "Liquidate? You stole my home. You emptied half the accounts. I'm in a hotel with Chloe, and she's hysterical. I have nothing. My clothes, my files, my entire life was in that building." I took a sip of the local rose I had poured myself. "You have Chloe, Julian. You said she deserves the world. Well, now, the 2 of you have the whole world to yourselves, unburdened by the domestic anchor of a wife and a mortgage. As for your clothes, I donated them to a local shelter for men getting back on their feet. I thought you'd appreciate the tax write-off." "You can't do this," he hissed, the familiar arrogance returning to his voice. "I'm a senior partner at the most powerful firm in Washington. I will sue you for every penny. I will find you, Elena, and I will make sure you're left with nothing." I laughed, and it was a sound of genuine, unadulterated joy. "Julian, you're a brilliant lawyer, but you're a terrible husband. You forgot that you taught me everything I know about contracts and asset protection. Every document I signed was vetted by the best firm in the state, your rivals, actually. The sales are ironclad. The funds are in international accounts you can't touch. And as for finding me, I'm in a place where I finally take up space. You spend your life looking at yourself in the mirror. You wouldn't even know how to look for someone who has finally become invisible to you. I hung up and blocked the number. Over the next 6 months, the transformation of the Mass became a local legend in the village. I learned to speak the rhythmic, melodic French of the region. I made friends with the baker, the woman who sold goat cheese at the market, and the elderly man who taught me how to press my own olive oil. They didn't know me as Mrs. Julian Vance. They knew me as Elena, the American architect with the sharp hair and the beautiful garden. I received updates through Clara and my legal team back in Seattle. Julian's life had spiraled with a velocity that surprised even me. Without the stable, organized home life I provided, his performance at the firm began to suffer. He was late for filings, missed client meetings, and his temperament became increasingly volatile. Chloe, realizing that the wealthy, powerful man she had seduced was now a man embroiled in a scandalous divorce and facing financial instability, had left him within 2 months. She didn't go quietly. She had reportedly threatened a sexual harassment suit unless the firm provided her with a substantial severance package. Julian was forced to take a leave of absence to deal with the fallout. The most satisfying news came nearly a year later. Julian had reached out to my lawyer with a request for a final meeting to sign the divorce decree. He had dropped all his counterclaims. He was tired, broke, and his reputation was in tatters. He wanted closure. We met in a neutral space in London, halfway between our new worlds. When Julian walked into the room, I almost didn't recognize him. The expensive suits were gone, replaced by a jacket that fit poorly. He looked older, the arrogance that had once defined him replaced by a haunted, hollowed-out expression. He stared at me for a long time, taking in my short hair, my tanned skin, and the way I sat in the chair with an ease I had never possessed in Bellevue. "You look different," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I feel different, Julian," I replied. "I feel like myself." He looked down at the papers on the table. "I lost everything, Elena. The firm, the reputation, the house. I'm living in a 2-bedroom apartment in Tacoma. Chloe took the car. I'm starting over at 54, and I don't even know who I am without the life we had." I reached across the table and pushed the pen toward him. "You didn't lose everything, Julian. You just lost the things you used to define yourself. You still have your life. You just have to decide what you're going to build with it." "Why did you do it?" he asked, looking up at me with eyes that were finally, for the first time in 30 years, seeing me. "Why didn't you just ask for a divorce? Why the houses? Why the disappearance?" Because I said softly, "If I had asked for a divorce, you would have made it a negotiation. You would have tried to win. You would have fought to keep me in the small, comfortable box you built for me. I didn't want a settlement, Julian. I wanted a rebirth. And for a woman like me, to be born the woman you created had to die completely." He signed the papers, then his hand shaking slightly. As I stood to leave, he called out my name one last time. "Elena, do you hate me?" I looked at him, and I realized with a profound sense of peace that I felt nothing. No anger, no resentment, not even pity. He was simply a stranger with whom I had shared a significant portion of my history. "No, Julian, I don't hate you," I said. "I'm just grateful to you. If you hadn't sent that text, I might have spent the rest of my life folding your shirts and wondering what lay beyond the horizon. You gave me the one thing I never would have given myself the permission to leave." I walked out of the room and into the bright London afternoon. I had a flight to Marseille in 3 hours and a garden that needed tending. The years that followed were the most productive of my life. My Mars became a featured project in international design magazines, not as the home of a wealthy socialite, but as a masterpiece of ecological restoration. I began taking on select clients, people who didn't want status symbols, but who wanted homes that breathed and lived in harmony with the land. I truly travelled not to five-star resorts where the staff spoke perfect English, but to remote villages in the Atlas Mountains and the rugged coasts of Portugal, sketching and learning and expanding the boundaries of my world. I never remarried. I found that I enjoyed the space in my bed and the silence in my halls. I had lovers men who appreciated my mind and my independence, but I never again allowed a man to become the architect of my identity. I was the one who drew the lines now. One evening, as I was sitting on my terrace with a glass of wine watching the fireflies dance above the lavender, I thought about the lesson I had learned from the wreckage of my first life. We are told that loyalty is the ultimate virtue, that standing by someone through their worst is the measure of our character. But there is a point where loyalty becomes a prison and where sacrifice becomes a form of self-erasure. The deepest human truth I discovered is that you cannot truly love another person until you have the courage to love yourself enough to walk away from a table where respect is no longer being served. We spend so much of our lives trying to be worthy of someone else's love, someone else's standards, or someone else's vision that we forget that our primary responsibility is to be worthy of our own soul. Julian had thought he was discarding a broken appliance. He didn't realize he was actually releasing a bird that had forgotten it could fly. The cost of my freedom had been high: the loss of a home, a history, and the security of a long-term marriage. But as I looked at the stars over the Provence hills, I knew it was the best bargain I had ever made. I had traded a glass penthouse for a stone house, a silent marriage for a vibrant life, and a man's approval for a woman's peace. And in the end, that wasn't just a successful transaction. It was a masterpiece. To those of you who find yourselves standing in the wreckage of a life you thought was permanent, who are reading a text message that feels like the end of the world, I want you to know, the end of a story, is often just the demolition required for a much more beautiful structure to be built. Do not be afraid of the silence, and do not be afraid of the empty space. It is in that space that you will finally find the person you were always meant to be. I am Elena Vance, and I am finally home. Now, as I sit here in the quiet beauty of my own creation, I often wonder about the stories unfolding in the cities you are watching from. From the rainy streets of London to the bright lights of Tokyo, from the bustling heart of New York to the quiet suburbs of Sydney, we are all architects of our own destiny. If you were standing where I stood with a suitcase packed and a heart shattered, what would you choose? Would you stay and fight for a structure that is already falling, or would you have the courage to clear the site and begin again? Our lives are not measured by the walls we build around us, but by the strength of the foundation we build within us. May you find the courage to be your own architect, to draw your own lines, and to never, ever let anyone make you feel like you deserve anything less than the whole world. I look forward to hearing where you are in your own journey. Thank you for walking through my garden with me today. Remember, the most important project you will ever work on is yourself.